Hi, I'm Fred Millar, and I live in Arlington, Virginia, but I've worked with a lot of people around the country on oil spill incidents over the years. I'm glad to see a lot of familiar faces. Mostly I've talked to people on phone and email, but it's great to have some faces here. I think I'm actually supposed to be sort of the fly in the ointment here and take issue with some of what's been said. And the main thing I want to say is that it's very important that even though it's very natural to be concerned about emergency response, I mean, we are at enormous risk. Emergency response is a distraction from what we have to do. And we need not be polite to the railroads, and we need not be polite to our state and local officials who keep pretending that they can be prepared. We need not be polite. What we need is the truth, and what we need is to work on prevention. And so I'm going to focus on the last part of what this program is about. Although I do have to say something. I mean, our emergency responders are in great peril. I mean, this is my favorite photo about the Baltimore train fire in 2001. Basically, these firefighters are gathered outside this train, a hazmat car burning in the tunnel, trying to decide whether to risk their lives and go in there when they don't know what they're dealing with. So these guys know that your people are at risk. And I mean, whole communities are at risk, but I mean, it is just unconscionable to pretend that basically there's anything you can do about a serious crude oil derailment. It's going to be rivers of fire moving into your community, like Megantic, 1.5 million gallons that happened there, 47 people died. And the fire chief from Maine who responded to that accident, is Tim Pellerin from Maine, the fire chief who responded to the Megantic disaster, after a long presentation about how difficult it was, his final word was, "We must not be focusing on emergency response, we must be focusing on prevention." Now, unfortunately, the railroads have offloaded emergency response preparations to our local communities. It's up to you, and your little individual community has got to be ready for this disaster, right? And of course you're not. And of course, people don't even, since the public is being kept in the dark, they don't even fund adequate emergency response capabilities. I mean, how can you have a good level of concern and preparedness and funding if you're told all the time that we've got this covered, we're prepared, no big deal. There's all these hazards out there, I mean, that's really a very insidious kind of line, and it keeps people powerless. I mean, the main fire chief that let me just go back to the first one. The main fire chief that I talked to after the Megantic was the emergency manager in Albany County, New York, and he has 2 unit trains every day rolling into his community and unloading into barges down the Hudson River. What could go wrong, right? And after I expressed to him that I had a long experience with local emergency planning committee work, and that I thought that a lot of people around the country were saying they're prepared when in fact they're not, his words to me were this: "Well, Fred, we always have to say we're prepared." This is a profession of people who believes that their job depends on keeping the public in the dark. And whether it's in fusion centers or whether it's in speeches where they talk about all these training programs they have, I mean, that's a very sad situation. But it just kind of indicates what it is that we're up against and what we have to deal with. Now, we are going to deal with it, but it's not going to be an easy job. There was a long delay in getting information to those guys. If we have an accident with crude oil in a really urban area, I'm talking about a big city, evacuating half a mile of a big city is what people want to be talking about. I mean, in terms of a crude oil derailment, you don't have days something to do this. This is like most of the people in Megantic were dead in the first few minutes, because that's just what happens. They talked about rivers of fire, the survivors did. Now instead, Look at this photo. This is what's happening all over the United States. Is in every little newspaper around the country. The industry is bringing in oil trains. Sometimes they call them transcare exercises and safety train, as CSX has. And they give them a little bit of classroom instruction, and then they bring them out to a simulated crude oil fire, and the paper and the TV shows inevitably a lie. As if firefighters ever have or ever will get this close to a burning crude oil tank car. It's a lie. It's a deliberate misperception, misinformation to the public, and the media is gullible. They just play into it, you know. You don't have to, but that's what they do. I said to the media people, I want to see pictures of firefighters' backs when they are retreating from a crude oil train like they're damn supposed to do under in the Orange Book guidelines. They all know they're supposed to do it. Folks, we have not lost a single firefighter in the United States or in North America. With all these accidents we've had, we've never lost a single firefighter because they all do retreat. Thank God, they all do retreat. That's what they know. That's what they've got to do. But you get all these misleading photos. Oops, I did wrong there. Oh, up here. You get all these misleading photos that say where firefighters, fire chiefs are quoted as saying, "Now we feel so much better prepared." You know, that's just sad. It's also very misleading. The Orange Book says, pull back a half a mile and let it burn. Okay, every one of us ought to have an Orange Book and wave it around in meetings like this and say, we are the citizens, we know what the federal direction says. For one tank car in a fire, as Matt mentioned this morning, pull back a half a mile and let it burn. And that's been out there for years. Now, one thing we learned, a hard lesson, an uninformed community means dead firefighters. In West Texas, 10 people died who were responding to an ammonium nitrate fire. In a fertilizer plant. In Waverly, Tennessee in 1977, 16 died around a propane tank car when it blew up in their faces. An uninformed community means a lot of dead firefighters. And at-risk citizens are being kept in the dark. I come from the last century when we actually passed two major federal right-to-know laws in 1986 and 1990. Now, the railroads got themselves exempted from those laws. Unlike all the rest of the chemical industry, the railroads got themselves exempted. There's 4,100 local emergency planning committees we heard mentioned today. I was on one of them in Washington, D.C. There's 4,100 of them, and I can assure you that all of those gentlemen, they're mostly gentlemen, they have one religious conviction, which is, let us not alarm the public. That is their religious conviction. So working with those folks is hopeless. We tried. We had to go back and get another right-to-know law that was stronger, but that hasn't been implemented well either. The railroad corporations withhold their own hidden risk documents from public view. There's 4 kinds of major risk documents that the Washington State Fire Chiefs are demanding, and the New York State Comptroller General, and 29 Minnesota legislators. I hope that all of you will be demanding those 4 kinds of hidden risk documents. We'll talk about that later. And governments fail to educate the public. Let me just illustrate that. This is a propane tank car. Have you ever seen that picture in an American newspaper? That's one propane tank car. BLEVE, it's called, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion in Illinois. This is a chlorine gas release over an American community. And this is a tiny, little 2 one-ton cylinders that released in Marshtown, Tennessee. 4,000 people got out because it came out so slowly they were able to run for their lives. The cloud was 10 miles long. This is what the Chlorine Institute says. The chlorine industry actually does say what their worst case scenario is. The only industry that says that. What it says here is we can put out one tank car can put out a cloud 15 miles long by 4 miles wide. Has any level of government ever told American citizens this? That we're bringing cargoes through our community, that the gas all gets out in 2 minutes, and it can boost the cloud 15 miles downwind by 4 miles wide. You've never heard that from your local or your state or your federal government. And that's because they want to keep routing these cargoes through our major cities. These are unit trains of crude oil. I mean, to say that we're going to have some kind of security concerns here and not tell people the truth about these. I mean, these are elephants tiptoeing through the tulips, folks. I mean, this is not something that any terrorist is going to have any trouble figuring out, right? Oh.
This is like a flashback. This is a touchpad.
So I just got to keep going like this. Okay. Luckily, we got a very outspoken CEO of Canadian Pacific Railroad, Hunter Harrison. He's very concerned about terrorism, and so is his board of directors. And in that second thing, he says rerouting trains hauling dangerous goods to avoid heavily populated areas, and keeping the list from the eyes of would-be criminals are keys to hauling them safely. In other words, we are concerned about it, but we're not going to tell you guys about it. And he says, luckily he says this to the Toronto Globe and Mail, I actually kind of would prefer to avoid congested areas like Chicago. Friends, Hunter Harrison, the CEO of Canadian Pacific, gets to decide whether to endanger Chicago or not, because he won't go around. You could go through Buda, Illinois, Or you go south through Kankakee, Illinois. Is that really a serious question? Is that in terms of safety or terrorism? I mean, really. Look, we have this major federal right to know law that has already been described as quite weak. Here's what we're not going to get. We're not going to get any reduction in the volatility of the cargo. We're not going to get any significantly more effective emergency response. That's impossible. We're not going to get any significantly safer tank cars. We're not going to get any urgent deadline for replacing the older tank cars. We're not going to get any significantly lower speeds. You know, we're not going to get any significant rerouting around cities. That is off the table for discussion. It wasn't even discussed in the rulemaking. It's rerouting around cities. We're not going to get any significant information to the public. And in fact, you know, there was this effort by the Obama administration to get information to the state emergency response agencies. Many of those refused to pass it on to the public, and they had to be sued with Freedom of Information Act requests and raise all kinds, the media had to raise hell with them just to get that information out of them. So it's kind of a glum prospect in terms of what we face in terms of the new federal regulations. And I want to make sure that you know that the bottom line for rail car safety was expressed by Carl Alexie, who's the staff director at head top official at the FRA Office of Safety. He said, and this was in a National Transportation Safety Board forum, that in effect he said, you can't build a tank car. If the trains are moving at 30 to 40 miles per hour, you cannot build a tank car that will withstand punctures at that speed. You cannot. And that's based on their own, FRA's own puncture research. And so now the railroads are saying, look, we're not going to slow down our speeds any further than we already have. We say we'll go 50 miles per hour through most of the country and 40 miles per hour through the top high-threat urban areas. Now, if we slow down our crude oil trains, they say, that means we'll have to slow down some of the rest of our traffic. And the AAR says to the big government, the NTSB Safety Forum, the government and industry people, now, fellas, if we slow down crude oil trains, we will also slow down other kinds of traffic. And our single biggest corporate customer is UPS. Now, if we slow down UPS's trains, they'll go back to truck. Does anybody out here want that? See, they think they got us over a barrel, not to make a bad pun, right? The railroads think, look, we're going to move this stuff, and we're going to move it at speed, and we're just going to get a little bit of window dressing in terms of some new regulations. But we'll see. I mean, right now we're still sort of on track for the DOT's predictions of about 10 derailments per year. Pennsylvania, by the way, I'm supposed to say, Pennsylvania lags way behind other states on this. I mean, I'm sorry to say. I took a hard look at Zaremski's study in Pennsylvania. The governor chose a track and wheel expert with a very narrow expertise. And sure enough, he showed that tracks and wheels can be real important in terms of derailments. But there's no major state legislative initiatives in Pennsylvania like there is in other states where you can put fees on the rail cars, bring the railroads into your Oil Spill Prevention Act, force the railroads to prove financial responsibility, demand more information from them. That's happening all in the rest of the country. And I listed some of the states at the top. It's not all the rest of the country, but in major other corridor city states, in major other corridor states, there's a lot of other work going on, and it's not happening here. I mean, like I come from Virginia, where we got a Democratic governor who did not say one word about crude oil trains until the day after he had a train burning in the James River. Okay? This is not exactly profiles in courage out there. So our citizens are doing mapping of things like this, and some fire chiefs are doing it, but they use the excuse about terrorism to say, well, we just can't afford to tell the public about it. That is another piece of misinformation that we just have to combat very vigorously. Thanks a lot.